Welcome to the 2026 series of Psychoanalytic Conversations. I'm Pani Madubela, an Executive Director of the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. The intention of this series of webinars is to stimulate thoughtful discussions of topics that are of significant human interest, yet topics that are often not engaged by psychoanalytic organizations, whose focus is exclusively that of clinical theory and practice. If you have ideas for future topics that the Institute might address, please contact us at our email address, info@rediscoveringpsychoanalysis.org. We hope you enjoy and feel educational benefit from this webinar. Thank you.
Hi, I want to welcome everybody to the second in the 2026 series of Psychoanalytic Conversations, which is sponsored by the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. Tonight's webinar presents a conversation on the important and emotionally charged topic of coming out in psychoanalysis. So tonight's conversation is going to be focused on two dimensions, which we are hoping to discuss. Firstly, how has the history of psychoanalysis addressed queerness? What have been the overt and covert ways in which its theories have been homophobic? And what is is this problem being genuinely remedied, or is lip service merely being paid to this issue? The second area that we'd like to look at is what are the challenges which continue today in terms of being queer and pursuing training as a psychoanalyst or as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. I'm going to move on to introductions. We are privileged to have an exceptional panel of incredible clinicians and scholars with us this evening. So our speaker tonight is Bruce Lang. Bruce is a Cape Town-based senior psychotherapist and psychoanalyst who's completing training with the South African Psychoanalytic Association. He holds an MA in clinical psychology and is a distinguished teacher, writer, and commentator on psychoanalytic theory. Prior to his work in private practice, Bruce had an illustrious career in theatre and television, working extensively as an actor, director, writer, and producer. Bruce will be sharing an incredibly moving paper on his experience and his thoughts this evening. Joining him is Kelly Bold. Kelly has a master's in clinical psychology as well. She practices in Johannesburg, and she's conducting psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic therapy with adult patients. She's also a supervisor and supervises the clinical work of many mental health professionals. She will soon be a member of the International Psychoanalytic Association. Prior to this phase of her career, Kelly worked for 12 years at the Rape Crisis Centre in Cape Town and was the director of the People Opposing Women Abuse organization. Most of us might recognize this as POWER. In the past 3 years, she has gained a reputation as an incredibly talented teacher of seminars on psychoanalytic theory. And we are incredibly fortunate to have with us an eminent psychoanalyst from Los Angeles, Dr. Philip J. Lance. Dr. Lance is well known within American psychoanalytic circles as a commentator and reviewer of recent books in psychoanalysis and as a teacher of this discipline with both the Psychoanalytic Center of California and the Southern California University of Health Sciences. His early career began as an Episcopalian priest, engaged in community organizing and leading a large nonprofit community development corporation for 20 years. He then obtained his PhD in clinical psychology with a dissertation titled Toward a Gay-Centered Liberation Psychology. He then graduated as a psychoanalyst and published in journals such as Studies in Gender and Sexuality and the Harvard Gay and Lesbian Review. In private practice in Hollywood, his research interests include comparative psychoanalytic theories and critical psychology. Finally, I am Megan Brooks-Ofianos. I'm an educational psychologist and psychoanalytic psychotherapist, as well as an aspiring psychoanalyst. My private practice is here in Johannesburg. where I also conduct neuropsychological and psychoeducational assessments. I'm very passionate about psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic theory, as well as how its various theories intersect with salient sociocultural phenomena such as race, gender, sexuality, and socioeconomics. And I am your chair for this evening. So let's jump in. We are going to start by listening to Bruce read his paper, which I'm very excited to hear because as I've read the paper, it is incredibly moving. I'd really like to hear Bruce speak it, which I think carries a different kind of feeling. Once Bruce has finished reading his paper, Kelly is going to add her perspectives, and then Philip will be invited to comment on both contributions. I then hope that this will evolve into a lively group discussion. I may also share some thoughts in that discussion as well. So, Bruce, over to you. Thank you so much for sharing this piece with us. We're very excited.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Thank you. And good evening to you all. It is a great privilege to be able to have this platform to share this paper with all of you. And I'd like to thank, obviously, Barnaby for inviting us to this platform and extend thanks to both Kelly and to Philip for your responses to this paper. And then I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So the title of my paper this evening is called Destroying What Arouses: Disavowal, Aversion, and the Defense of Heterosexual Privilege. So Aristophanes, in Plato's Symposium, offers a myth of origins where love is born of loss. Once human beings were whole, spherical creatures who rolled upon the earth in their completeness, yet their forms were not singular. Some doubled as man with man, others as woman with woman, and still others as man with woman. This multiplicity of genders carried within it a plenitude of desire, a polymorphous field of possibilities. Threatened by such fullness, the gods split them apart, leaving each half-wounded, haunted by the memory of a lost other. From that incision arises the restless pursuit we call love, the search not only for a partner, but for the echo of an ancient wholeness. Desire, in this vision, is never fixed. It circulates across genders, across bodies, across time, forever marked by the impossibility of return, and yet endlessly compelled by the dream of reunion. Desire. The Spanish playwright Federico Garcia Lorca writes, "To burn with desire and keep quiet about it is the greatest punishment we can bring on ourselves." Yet the matter is more complex. Desire is never innocent. It traverses lust, fascination, envy, and disgust. What concerns us here is the moment when sexual desire, specifically same-sex desire, becomes named as repugnant, unacceptable, or pathological. At that point, what begins as an internal conflict is externalized and codified. Erotic ambivalence hardens into diagnostic category. Private unease is transformed into institutional policy. And when institutions police desire, they do more than regulate behavior. They enact a defense. The intensity of hatred, even the strange excitation that accompanies the destruction of the deviant, suggests something more than moral conviction. I want to suggest that institutional homophobia operates through disavowal. What is felt internally as arousing or destabilizing is repudiated and expelled. The unwanted excitation is attacked outside in order to extinguish it within. The punishment of the homosexual body becomes a way of mastering by destruction, the very desire that threatens the heterosexual order from inside it. In psychoanalytic terms, disavowal names a refusal that is never simple. A reality is registered and simultaneously repudiated. Aversion is not mere dislike, but a recoil charged with emotion, often lubricated by moral certainty. And together, they form a psychic grammar through which institutions can police desire while preserving the fantasy of innocence. If institutions can be understood as organized defenses, then the clinic is one of those places those defenses change form, from policy into atmosphere, from doctrine into sensation. Disavowal is not only an idea, it is felt. It appears as a sudden blankness, a tightening, a recoil, a wish to make something disappear. An aversion, too, is rarely calm. It carries a charge, a pulse, a moral certainty that can mask excitement. And psychoanalysis, despite its self-image, is not exempt. The analytic situation is an erotic situation, even when nothing erotic is said. Bodies are present, meanings are made, and the social world is smuggled in through what each of us has been trained to see as normal. So I want to begin where these forces become intimate. In a consulting room, on a Cape Town afternoon, in the moment my own body, read as male, presumed heterosexual, becomes part of the material. So it's a blistering Cape Town afternoon, the air thick with heat, and I'm meeting a potential patient, a young woman, who enters with ease that unsettles me, a direct gaze, controlled poise, and an almost performative confidence. She sits and says with disarming candor, "I'm wearing as little as possible for what is legally permissible." I hold my neutrality, but inwardly I falter. What the fuck? I'm gay. In psychoanalysis, the analyst's body is never absent. We may cultivate what we call neutrality, but neutrality is not invisibility. The patient sees us, hears us, and most powerfully feels us in the libidinal and fantasy life that animates the analytic space. Yet here a further tension arises. Psychoanalysis itself has a long theoretical history of gendering and pathologizing the body, often marking homosexuality as confusion, perversion, or threat. Can the analyst ever inhabit a body that is not already overdetermined by this history? Can we imagine a body through which erotic and libidinal currents flow without being captured by categories of male or female, heterosexual or homosexual? Or does clinging to these categories, consciously or unconsciously, reinforce the very aversion and disavowal that psychoanalysis has too often enacted? So externally, I appear as what one might designate a man. I possess a penis, I shave each morning, I'm read and recognized within a masculine frame. Internally, however, there resides another body, the body of desire, layered in both conscious and unconscious strata. For many years, this interior body was bound by abject shame. Later coming out appeared to offer me catharsis, but it proved to be a deceptive relief. And in response, I took up a politics of visibility, advocating for the marginalized self and demanding a place at the center. Yet paradoxically, even as I campaigned for belonging, I continued to situate myself at the margins. My analytic training has led me to a different recognition, that the shame I experienced, as if it were intrinsic, was in fact enacted by internalized figures of the outside world. These alien presences, like parasitic trespassers, had taken residence within me. I in turn sustained them. I housed and fed them. What I took to be the most intimate truth of my subjectivity was in reality the voice of these aliens made flesh through my psychic life. Through the discipline of psychoanalysis, I'm beginning to translate these spectral presences, what T.S. Eliot names shape without form, shade without color, into a dread that can be named. In this movement from the inchoate to the representable lies the possibility of transformation. And in recognizing that this dread is not mine alone, but a horror that we all share, I return it here to you, not as an object of fear, but as a potential site of learning, of thinking, and of shared discovery. So the past, as psychoanalysis reminds us, is always present. Apartheid was marked by countless scenes of brutality, each leaving scars that do not remain in the past, but haunt the present. The Aversion Project, carried out by the South African Defence Force between 1968 and 1987, exemplifies this haunting, an atrocity that continues to reverberate as the return of a violence never worked through. Conducted at the infamous Psychiatric Ward 22 of the No. 1 Military Hospital in Pretoria, this program sought to convert homosexual conscripts into heterosexuals. And this was despite homosexuality's removal from the DSM in 1973. I just want us to remember that date, 1973, the DSM removed homosexuality as a pathology. But in South Africa, it remained both criminalized and classified as subversive. Conscripted men were subjected to systematic humiliations, aversion shock therapy, chemical castration, forced hormonal and drug treatments, and in cases deemed intractable, sexual reassignment procedures. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission later recorded that psychiatrists were experimenting with aversion therapy on patients who, other than being labeled homosexual, were healthy. So in practice, electrodes were affixed to a subject's forearms, sometimes to their genitals, and this was connected to a calibrated machine. The subject was then presented with black and white images of a nude male and instructed to fantasize. And then escalating currents produced painful muscular contractions until cries of distress or explicit pleas for cessation. The images were then replaced with a Playboy centerfold, and this was repeated several times per session, twice daily, across consecutive days. And this procedure inscribed a pairing of homoerotic fantasy with bodily pain, followed by the substitution of heterosexual imagery. Many conscripts reported prolonged psychic disorientation, not only from the somatic trauma, but from the enforced disruption of associative and identificatory processes at the level of desire. Where such therapy was deemed insufficient, subjects were consigned to sexual reassignment programs. And between 1968 and 1987, over 900 conscripts were subjected to chemical castration or forced surgical gender reassignment, often with catastrophic results. The belief was, if these men could not be men, then there must be women. Survivors were issued with new state identities and instructed to sever ties with their families. Subsequent investigations by the Gay and Lesbian Archives revealed widespread aftermaths of suicide, chronic psychiatric illnesses, and enduring psychic fragmentation among those subjected to these interventions. And despite the findings presented to the TRC, no individual has ever been held liable for these violations. The legacy of the Aversion Project thus persists as a profound insistence of disavowed violence, where state power inscribed itself upon the body and the psyche in an attempt to erase desire itself. Now, it must be emphasized that the Aversion Project was conceived and directed by psychiatrists, but carried out by a wide array of medical personnel, psychologists, social workers, nurses, and doctors. Its theoretical foundation was explicitly behavioral, not psychoanalytic. So at first glance then, one might be tempted to distance psychoanalysis from such practices. This was not us. But can we so easily exempt ourselves? Was psychoanalysis caught in the same currents of exclusion and disavowal. Histories of homophobia, with all the terror and humiliation they have inscribed into individual and collective bodies, are so frequently met with disavowal. There is a turning away, a psychic numbing, as though to acknowledge such violence in the present would threaten the coherence of our professional and cultural self-understanding. The historical archive suggests that psychoanalysis did more than passively reflect prevailing prejudices. At certain junctures, its metapsychology furnished the very language through which homosexuality could be rendered as arrest, deviation, or failure of development, all in the name of psychological science. What appeared as neutral theory carried within it a normative ideal against which lives were measured. In this way, psychoanalytic discourse became entangled in a mythic structure: heterosexuality as maturational ideal, homosexuality as unfinished work. Such formulations did not remain confined to the consulting rooms or journals. In collusion, sometimes overt, sometimes structural, with state and religious authorities, they provided conceptual legitimation for practices of profound cruelty, including the brutality of the SADF's aversion project. So to confront this history is not to repudiate psychoanalysis wholesale, but to refuse the comfort of innocence. It requires that we consider how theory itself can become an instrument not only of understanding, but of exclusion, and how silence too participates in the transmission of violence. So it was only in 1991 that the American Psychoanalytic Association formally affirmed that homosexuality is not a pathology. Until then, homosexual applicants were regularly excluded from training, often under the guise of subjective criteria such as analyzability or educatability. And change did not come from within the discipline, but under the pressure of a threatened lawsuit alleging discrimination. Afterward, APSA began to admit homosexual candidates in training cases. Other psychoanalytic institutions did not rush to follow. So it was only in 2002, over 10 years later, did the International Psychoanalytical Association, the IPA, and the British Psychoanalytical Association issue official non-discriminatory statements. Most strikingly, it was only in the January of 2012 that the British Psychoanalytic Council declared unequivocally that homosexual orientation is not a form of mental disturbance, thereby formally ending exclusionary practices and allowing homosexual individuals to be considered for candidacy. So these dates compel us to confront a more unsettling truth. For much of the 20th century, psychoanalysis itself served as the dominant framework for understanding human sexuality. And it was within psychoanalytic theory that homosexuality was elaborated, codified, and entrenched as pathology. Far from offering resistance, psychoanalysis contributed to the climate in which aversion techniques could be imagined as legitimate. Such formulations did not remain confined to consulting rooms or journals. In collusion, sometimes overt, sometimes structural, with state and religious authorities, they provided conceptual legitimation for practices of profound cruelty, including this brutality of the SADF's aversion project. Its exclusions from training, its theoretical formulations, and its silence in the face of state-sanctioned treatments all testify to a deeper complicity. The discipline did not merely fail to protect homosexual subjects, it actively participated in the conceptual production of their abnormality. So within the canon of psychoanalysis, there is a striking tendency to overlook its homophobic inheritances. My aim here this evening is not to deny the brilliance of Freud, Anna Freud, Klein, Fairbairn, Siegel, Rosenfeld, and others. Their thought forms the very foundation of our discipline. Yet fidelity to psychoanalysis requires more than reverence. It calls for excavation. Freud himself described the analyst's task as archaeological, uncovering layer after layer of the psyche to recover what is lost. So too, we are tasked with sifting through the layers of our tradition to expose the exclusions, silences, and stains that lie beneath the polished surface. For it is precisely in these fractures and contradictions that the psyche of psychoanalysis was formed. What has been repressed must be brought into consciousness. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to trace the full genealogy of homophobia in psychoanalysis, but certain decisive moments must be revisited. So let's go way back to 1886. Richard von Krafft-Ebing constructed the category homosexual in his monumental Psychopathia Sexualis, giving it judicial and medical weight. What had once been an act, sodomy, a verb, was transposed into a noun, into a permanent identity, a crystallized being. As Foucault captures with unforgettable precision, sodomy was a category of forbidden acts. Their author was nothing more than the judicial subject of them. The 19th century homosexual became a personage, a past, a case history, and a childhood, a character, a form of life. Nothing in his total being escapes his sexuality. Everywhere in him it is present, underlying all his actions, shamelessly inscribed on his face and on his body, because it is a secret that always gives itself away. Homosexuality appeared as one of the forms of sexuality when it was transposed from the practice of sodomy onto a kind of interior androgyny, a hermaphroditism of the soul. The sodomite was a temporary aberration. The homosexual is now a species. So with this discursive mutation, the homosexual was born, not as a fleeting sinner, but as a pathological type, a dangerous criminal to be institutionalized, observed, and corrected. Before 1886, such an identity did not exist. After 1886, it became indelibly written into the medical, legal, and cultural imagination. So let us hold on to that thought. The homosexual was conjured into being through a fusion of law and medicine, a fabrication of the 19th century that carried immense psychic weight. The homosexual is named and becomes noun. So it was in this climate that the young Dr. Freud began his explorations into the mind, quietly formulating what would become psychoanalysis. The atmosphere was thick with debates. How should psychiatry and psychology respond to this new problem of the homosexual? Was it degeneration, illness, perversion, or something else entirely? Freud's writings reveal a profound ambivalence. On the one hand, he followed the medicalized discourse of the time, situating homosexuality within the language of inversion. But on the other hand, he insisted that all humans are psychically bisexual, and that infantile sexuality is polymorphous and multiple, never confined to a single fixed path. His 3 essays on the theory of sexuality can then be read as an antithesis to Krafft-Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis, where Krafft-Ebing sought to classify, condemn, and pathologize. Freud unsettled prevailing certainties. In its opening, he declares, "We have every reason to believe, however, that these views give a very false picture of the true situation. If we look into them more closely, we shall find that they contain a number of errors, inaccuracies, and hasty conclusions." So in that gesture, Freud cracked open the monolith of sexual instinct and gestured toward a more fluid, unstable terrain. If Krafft-Ebing created the homosexual as a species, Freud hinted at the instability of species altogether. Freud's theorization of sexuality rests on the premise of an originary bisexuality. Yet within his writings, one encounters a certain ambivalence and blurring of his position. In 3 essays, the first 2 essays destabilize the notion of normative sexual trajectory, presenting the drive as polymorphous, mobile, and protean. In the third, however, sexuality is reinscribed within the framework of heterosexual procreation as its presumed aim. So this oscillation is echoed in his treatment of homosexuality, at times described as a disturbance, while in the 1935 letter to an American mother, he reassures homosexuality is nothing to be ashamed of. No vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. So this tension is mirrored in the life and work of Anna Freud, his daughter. In her clinical writings, she conceptualized homosexuality as a developmental arrest, the outcome of unresolved identification with parental figures. In her later institutional role, she reinforced the exclusion of homosexual candidates from analytic training within the British Psychoanalytical Society. And yet, her own life was marked by a deeply intimate, enduring partnership with Dorothy Burlingham, the American heiress and child psychoanalyst, with whom she lived in London from the 1920s until her death in 1982. The irony is not lost. The author of The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense may herself exemplify what she theorized as reaction formation. It's poignant that Burlingham's ashes were placed with Anna Freud's in Freud Corner at the Golders Green Crematorium in London. Ronald Fairbairn's writings reveal the persistence of homophobic assumptions within even the most innovative strands of psychoanalysis. In the midst of his larger project of de-eroticizing the libido and advancing the centrality of the object relations, Fairbairn expressed frustration at homosexual men's refusal to regard themselves as disturbed or to seek change. In a 1946 essay, he dismissed homosexuality with evident distaste, describing it as the natural sexual expression of a personality which has become perverse in its essential structure. Such phrasing underscores how Fairbairn's theoretical innovations continue to frame same-sex desire within a deficit model, embedding pathology into the very structure of personality. Melanie Klein's contemporaneous innovations took a different route. While she revolutionized psychoanalysis by shifting its focus from drives to object relations and unconscious fantasy, emphasizing the centrality of the other from the earlier stages of life, her theorization of infantile sexuality nonetheless assumed a natural heteronormativity grounded in genital difference and situated within a two-parent family structure. With the de-eroticization of the libido, an emphasis on object relations, her framework implicitly positioned homosexuality as pathological. Heterosexuality was affirmed as the norm, while homosexuality appeared as developmental failure. In Envy and Gratitude, Klein suggested, homosexuality may then be based on the need to find a good object instead of the avoided primal object. The fact that such people, and this applies to men as well as to women, can have good object relations is therefore often deceptive. The underlying envy toward the primal object is split off, but remains operative and is liable to disturb any relations. I mean, this passage is fraught with ambiguity, but the implication remains that such people can never fully achieve authentic relationships. This heteronormative ground was reinforced by Klein's followers. Hannah Siegel was unequivocal in her view that homosexuality represented a developmental arrest and insisted, my clinical judgment is that homosexuality is a narcissistic condition. Siegel's uncompromising prejudice illustrates how psychoanalytic authority perpetuated homophobic discourse. After the Second World War, such pathologization accelerated. Psychoanalytic historians such as Herzog, Hertzman, and Newbegin document the proliferation of contradictory and often comical explanations. Male homosexuality is described as a defense against castration, an over-identification with a seductive mother, a fear of female genitals, or a hapless attempt to repair masculine inadequacy. Across much of the world, these theories converged with legal structures that criminalized same-sex relations, reinforcing the figure of the homosexual as both the perverse patient and dangerous criminal. The consolidation of this discourse was exemplified in Irving Bieber's Homosexuality, a study of male homosexuals, based on 106 homosexual men in treatment compared with 100 controls. Bieber and his team concluded that homosexuality stemmed from a family constellation involving an over-involved mother and a rejecting father. They rejected Freud's notion of innate bisexuality and denied the existence of a homosexual phase in development. But this study was on the basis of flawed methodology. 90% of the homosexual group had concealed their orientation. Nearly 2/3 of this group entered analysis hoping to be cured, and no subjects who accepted their homosexuality were included. The report provocatively reframed homosexuality as latent heterosexuality. But any account of homophobia in psychoanalysis must infamously acknowledge Charles Socarides, whose institutional power and cultural visibility entrenched the pathologization of homosexuality well into the late 20th century. Socarides condemned the APA's 1973 decision to declassify homosexuality as a mental disorder as a political act, not a scientific one, and repeatedly described homosexuality as a tragic pathology and a psychic arrest in the early stages of development. He co-founded the National Association for Research and Therapy of Homosexuality, a hub for conversion therapy, and became a prominent spokesperson for conservative and religious groups seeking scientific authority. His insistence that homosexuality was a cureless malady that society ignores at its peril shows how psychoanalytic authority reverberated far beyond the clinic, influencing culture and policy alike. One of his more damning pronouncements declared, "Those sexually active deviants who display evidence of a latent paranoid psychosis should not be offered analysis. As patients, they are too hostile, aggressive, and contemptuous to be able to cope with the intensity of 4 or 5 times a week therapy. Their tendency to be promiscuous and to frequent public lavatories in pursuit of daily casual sex, often associated with profoundly perverted activities, makes them difficult to reach." So reading the history of homophobic discourse in psychoanalysis has been for me difficult. And at times I felt sickened by reading what has been written, having to reread to see if this is what I'm actually reading. And I wish to present some of the more violent quotations. A warning, they are unsettling and at times arousing. In 1933, Glover writes, "There is no consideration of the shame and furtiveness that might originate in the fear about committing an arrestable offense. Instead, it is understood exclusively as an internal world phenomenon, a manifestation of a perverse desire to restrict relationship to a primitive one with body parts rather than to a whole person." Bergler in 1956 writes, "Homosexuals are essentially disagreeable people. Their shell is like a mixture of superciliousness, fake aggression, and whimpering. Like all psychic masochists, they are subservient when confronted with a stronger person, merciless when in power, unscrupulous about trampling on a weaker person. The only language their unconscious understands is brute force." Bieber in 1965 writes, "Many homosexuals prefer to regard their condition as constitutionally determined. They more readily accept a view of themselves as biological freaks." Rom in 1965 writes, "Homosexuals of both sexes are basically unhappy because normal family life with the fulfillment of having children can never be within their reach. The label gay, behind which they hide, is a defense mechanism against the emptiness, the coldness, and the futility of their lives. Oversea, in 1965, writes, "There is only one way that the homosexual can overcome this phobia and that is to learn to have heterosexual intercourse, and that way is in bed with a woman. Sooner or later, the homosexual patient must make the necessary attempts to have intercourse, and he must make them again and again until he is capable of having a sustained erection, penetration, and pleasurable intravaginal orgasms." And then the South African, later British psychoanalyst, Glasser, writes in 1986, "The widespread use the pervert makes of simulation is perhaps most easily observed socially in the rather artificial histrionic quality of the so-called camp behavior and manner of many homosexuals, which they turn on or play down without any conscious instruction to themselves. This ability to live apart rather than to merely play it reminds one of certain type of psychopaths." Psychoanalysis, psychoanalysts. So it may seem in 2026 that contemporary psychoanalysis has rediscovered the sexuality it was always seeking. Yet, as we know, the past is never past. It presses into the present. In 2021, Avgi Sakatapalau and Anne Pellegrini were awarded the inaugural Tiresias Prize by the International Psychoanalytic Association for their paper, "A Feminine Boy, Normative Investments and Reparative Fantasy at the Intersections of Gender, Race and Religion." They were invited to submit the work to the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, and it was accepted, but on the condition that they remove a key acknowledgement welcoming queer subjects as offering opportunities from which to rethink our metapsychology anew. And refusing to retract these words, they withdrew their paper. Then the editors warned them against publishing it elsewhere. They responded by including it as a chapter in their book, Gender Without Identity, a refusal to split their politics from their theory. And a similar dynamic of institutional disavowal can be found in the British Psychoanalytics Council 2021 conference, Sexual Diversity and Psychoanalysis, Acknowledging the Past and Looking to the Future. So what was presented as an opportunity for reckoning came to function, as Kentridge and Robinson have argued, as a repetition of the very injury it sought to address. In the lead up to the conference, a proposed apology to the LGBT community was progressively diluted through internal contestation until it emerged as a carefully negotiated statement of regret. The final wording distanced the institution from responsibility for past and ongoing harms, and tellingly omitted the T, addressing only the LGB community. What occurred was less an act of repair than a managed concession, acknowledgement without ownership, sorrow without accountability. The institution appeared to approach its history only to recoil, preserving its coherence by displacing the most destabilizing elements. Rather than marking a rupture with the past, the event revealed how heterosexual privilege can persist through carefully calibrated contrition. The gesture acknowledged harm while preserving institutional innocence. A different response emerged from the Finnish Psychoanalytical Society in June 2022. Its public apology named psychoanalysis's complicity with unusual directness. The Society explicitly acknowledged that theories advanced within its sphere had stigmatized sexual and gender minorities as pathological, developmentally arrested, or abnormal. It extended its apology not only to the ideas themselves, but to the practices carried out in their name, including attempts to alter sexual orientation, the framing of homosexuality or gender diversity as explanatory for psychic distress, and the broader harms that followed. These harms were recognized as violations of autonomy, dignity, and equality, with consequences that reached into the professional and social life. The Society also acknowledged its earlier failure to repudiate such views, affirming that psychoanalysts bear ethical responsibility for the effects of the theories they promulgate. In doing so, it made explicit the link between metapsychology, treatment, and social consequence. So the difference between these two was not semantic. Regret mourns delay. Apology assumes responsibility. These are not merely institutional variations. They reflect different psychic positions. One is organized around distance and evolutionary narrative, the other around ownership. And it is within this psychic economy that homosexuality has long been held, first as a pathology, a diagnostic fiction dressed in scientific authority. Psychoanalysis did not invent this fiction, but at moments it fortified it. Homosexuality was rendered deviation, arrest, compromise. Myth presented as metapsychology. And when myth ossifies into fact, violence acquires legitimacy. In the Aversion Project, theory sanctioned torture. The body marked as deviant became the site upon which institutional fantasy was enacted. Within training institutes, the mechanism was quieter. The analyst was imagined as someone who had traversed Oedipal conflict, achieved object constancy, and consolidated stable adult sexuality. Yet, stability was tacitly presumed heterosexual. Heterosexual genital relating signified developmental completion. Homosexuality did not need explicit condemnation. It could simply be read as unfinished psychic work. So exclusion rarely required written prohibition. It appeared as clinical prudence, questions of ego strength, suitability, countertransference management. Doubt disguised itself as care. Heterosexuality functioned as the invisible measure of maturity. Anything outside it bore the burden of explanation. The psychic consequence was profound. Because rejection was seldom named as discrimination, it could be internalized as confirmation. The candidate might experience refusal not as injustice, but as evidence of personal incompletion. The wound would be carried privately. This is how heterosexual privilege operated, both overtly and structurally. The gay candidate was not simply evaluated, he was pre-positioned as developmentally deficient. His object choice was treated not as one variation among others, but as evidence of structural flaw. The exclusion was categorical, yet articulated in the language of critical concern. What might have been recognized as institutional bias was instead metabolized as personal failure. And it is here that heterosexual privilege reveals its regulatory force. To be heterosexual is not merely to desire differently. It is to be spared the demand to explain one's desire at all. Homosexuality, by contrast, is repeatedly required to account for itself. Explanation becomes the mark of deviance. So I want to end where I began, with Aristophanes. In the Symposium, he tells us we were once whole, later split by the gods, condemned to search for our missing half. It is a myth of division and of destined completion, but Freud unsettles that myth. In the 3 essays, he proposes something far more radical. that the infantile sexual drive is not oriented in advance. It is polymorphous, diffuse, capable of attaching to multiple objects. He names this disposition bisexual, not as identity, but as structural condition. Desire precedes alignment. The unconscious does not begin heterosexual. It does not begin homosexual. It begins without narrative. Orientation emerges later as history, as identification, as prohibition, as compromise formation. If this is so, then heterosexuality is not nature fulfilled. It is one stabilization among others. And like any stabilization, it requires defense. What we call heterosexual privilege may be less an assertion of strength than a defense against the anxiety of an original interdeterminacy. And yet, in a session with a female patient during a charged moment, I found myself thinking, with a flash of irritation, what the fuck, I'm gay. The force of the thought startled me. What was being defended? Was I resisting an unconscious heterosexual script? Or was something older being stirred? Something institutional? Something inherited? When I began my training, I did not know that homosexuality had once been theorized as developmental arrest. Had I known, would I have entered differently? I sometimes wonder if I've overcompensated, read more, prepared more meticulously, as though analytic authority required additional proof, as though somewhere I absorbed the injunction to demonstrate that my desire did not signify deficit. This is the quiet afterlife of theory. If infantile bisexuality is the starting point, then every adult orientation represents a narrowing, a necessary one, perhaps, but a narrowing nonetheless. The danger begins when one narrowing declares itself destiny and another deviation. When theory mistakes narrative for nature, it regulates what it claims merely to describe. And that regulation does not remain abstract. It enters bodies, it enters institutes, it enters the consulting room. It entered mine. If psychoanalysis is to claim ethical seriousness, it must interrogate not only its overt history, but its unconscious investments in its normative resolution. Otherwise, psychoanalysis does not interpret the defense. It becomes the defense. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Bruce. I feel incredibly moved, quite emotional actually. So I'm going to hand over to Kelly, who is going to respond to this paper. Yeah, I need to gather my own thoughts, but so I'm going to jump over to Kelly straight away, actually.
Thanks, Megan. Thank you, Bruce, my friend. Yeah, so I've made a few notes and a few of my thoughts on Bruce's paper. On hearing Bruce's paper, I cried. Not politely and not analytically, I cried. I felt an almost bodily grief for my friend who has endured a lifetime of blows, a lifetime of being forced to inhabit a body rendered dangerous by the projections of others. I have not lived inside that fear. What came up for me instead was shame. Shame at my passing privilege. I have never had to hide my bisexuality, not once. I've been read as a feminine woman, a mother, as a wife to a wonderful man for over a decade, and then after our divorce, again the privilege of being in a long, loving relationship with a wonderful woman. I have never woken nor worried in my work thinking, oh God, I'm gay, or oh God, I'm straight. For me, it was always, oh, fuck off, I'm bisexual. That defiance was my shield. It protected me from the projected binaries that others, patients included, sometimes needed me to inhabit. I did not fit, and that not fitting became a quiet refuge. Politically and culturally, bisexuality is often treated as excess. We are accused of having our cake and eating it. We are not permitted to want more than one form of attachment, let alone to sustain it. The 1990s Bisexual Manifesto, Anything That Moves, insisted that bisexuality is whole and fluid, not binary, not necessarily duogamous, not dependent on simultaneous involvement with both genders, and certainly not reducible to confusion or promiscuity. That insistence still feels urgent. Why do we need the category bisexual to contain and regulate those desires that threaten social mythology? Following Juliet Mitchell, Claire Buck argues that bisexuality marks the instability of sexual difference itself, that it exposes masculinity and femininity not as fixed identities, but as positions of desire to which the subject has a shifting and uncertain relation. Bisexuality does not sit between heterosexuality and homosexuality. It unsettles the coherence of both. In this sense, bisexuality begins to look less like an identity and more like an anti-identity, not a refusal of desire, but a refusal to confine it. And here I want to say something about the third. From a psychoanalytic perspective, triangulation is not incidental, it's foundational. Freud's Oedipal formulation situates desire within rivalry and mediation. The third interrupts fusion and makes desire possible. Laplanche radicalizes this further. The subject is formed through enigmatic messages implanted by the other, messages that exceed our capacity to understand them at the time. We spend a lifetime translating them. Desire does not originate inside a sovereign individual. It emerges within a triangulated field of transmission, misrecognition, and reworking. The third, then, is not a deviation. It's the condition of psychic life. And when we apply this to bisexuality, triangularity ceases to look like indecision. It may instead represent fidelity to the structural truth that desire exceeds binary containment. In a dyad, positions tend to harden: masculine, feminine, active, passive, self, other. In a triad, identification circulates, role shifts, and the fantasy of purity destabilizes. Perhaps what is eroticized for some of us is not merely the object, but the structure, movement rather than resolution. So bisexuality then does not signify confusion. It reveals that orientation itself is less stable than we would like to believe. So what was I frightened of? My body was not dangerous. It was exposed, vulnerable, available for interpretation, for possession. It was men's bodies I feared, their desire, their omnipotence, their aggression. That fear was internalized and it was translated. And it led me, not coincidentally, into the politicized world of gender-based violence. A repetition, perhaps. A return to the site of enigmatic messages that were never mine to decode. Laplanche has given me relief here. His notion of après coup, the retroactive retranslation of earlier experiences, it allows for forgiveness. Each sting, each summons demanding meaning. These were adult meanings that arrived before I had the apparatus to metabolize them. I translated as best I could, sometimes defensively, sometimes militantly, sometimes heroically, and sometimes badly. But they were not originally mine. There was a double pain in Bruce's excavation, the pain of his story and the pain of psychoanalysis. We know theoretically about splitting and projection, about the casting of internal conflicts into binaries that are then reinterjected as destiny. We teach it. And yet, we've not been immune to enacting those very narrowings within our institutions. We have sometimes allowed one configuration to declare itself natural and another pathological. We've sometimes confused cultural anxiety with clinical truth. I've always, perhaps naively, believed in the progressive potential of psychoanalysis, not because it's innocent and certainly not because it's been unmarked by prejudice, but because it begins with something radical, Freud's insistence on polymorphous sexuality, the idea that desire is multiple, diffuse, not naturally confined to one object, one form, one destiny. That idea has been a quiet refuge for me. It's allowed me to think that perhaps there is space in our discipline for those of us who do not fit easily, that perhaps our consulting rooms can tolerate ambiguity, not as pathology, but as structure, not as confusion, but as truth. And yet, listening to Bruce, I felt something else alongside hope. I felt how fragile that belief is, how easily the very theories that promise multiplicity can become narrowed in practice, how easily we can mistake our own discomfort for clinical judgment. So perhaps what I'm really asking for this evening is not certainty, not even agreement, but space. Space to remain in translation, space not to resolve too quickly, space to allow sexuality and gender to surprise us, to unsettle us, to exceed what we think we already know. If psychoanalysis is at its best a discipline that listens to what does not yet have language, then perhaps our task is not to defend our categories, but to stay close to the places where they fail. I do not want us to be brave in a grand, heroic way. I want us to be brave in a small way, in the consulting room, when something doesn't fit our theory, in ourselves, when something doesn't fit our identity. I want us to stay with a third, not as threat, not as deviation, but as the place where something new might begin. Perhaps the real courage is in not deciding who we are, but in allowing ourselves and our patients to remain unfinished.
Thank you so much for that, Kelly. So I'm going to ask Dr. Philip Lance if he has, or to share his thoughts on both Bruce's paper as well as Kelly's response. Dr. Lance, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, first of all, what an honor to be included at the Institute for Rediscovering Psychoanalysis, which I believe is the most vital and exciting psychoanalytic institute in the whole world. And so it's fantastic to be here. And I really believe that. So my comments are mostly about Bruce's paper, but I want to say I really appreciate how Kelly brought a lot of feeling to her response, because it made me recognize how I kind of left that piece out. But the way Kelly began with this deep feeling response to what she was hearing in the paper really almost brought tears to my eyes about that we're dealing here with much more than just an intellectual issue. We're dealing with hundreds of years of people's lives being affected in painful ways. I wanted to just sort of then go to the paper and say some of the things I liked about the paper, and then elaborate on some points I thought were especially good. There was such an impressive paper, partly because of the way it summarizes and brings together in such a succinct way kind of the history, the way that homosexuality and queerness has been thought about in psychoanalysis for a couple hundred years, and in the larger context of Western intellectual history. And sadly, for much of this history, the psychoanalytic conceptualization of homosexuality has been determined by the dominant sociopolitical episteme rather than by the revolutionary genius of psychoanalysis. And Bruce did a fantastic job of helping us see how queerness can critique the phenomena of queerness, critique much of mainstream, what's called mainstream psychoanalysis, and can rescue it from psychoanalysis from where it's gone astray. So it brings together so much. A lot of what Bruce reviewed was things I'd sort of read through the years and had to kind of cobble together, but this is all in one place. It'll be a great source, I think, for people who are interested in this topic, almost like a reference to sort of know where to begin and where to do further research. But there was some of the new stuff, these quotes by Melanie Klein, Ronald Fairbairn, Hannah Siegel, and others, truly shocking. And these three I picked out, Klein, Fairbairn, and Siegel, because these were the sacrosanct authors at the institute where I was trained. And yet, these things they said about sexuality and queerness were never talked about in my training, which I guess really is the way more it works nowadays. We see less explicit disparagement of queer people and more of just kind of a silent disavowal. And so it made me think about that quote from Oscar Wilde, where he said, "The only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about," which kind of makes a joke and sort of trivializes something that I'm looking for where Bruce said it in his paper. Silence participates in the transmission of violence. And that's the way I experienced it mostly in my training. The kind of the homophobia was in the silence around the whole matter. How it's something we just didn't talk about. Although I could give more specific examples of how I encountered homophobic supervisors and experiences in my training, but I think I don't have enough time to. Maybe if we have time, I can bring up one of those incidents as we go on here. Another thing I liked about this paper was its literary quality. It was I mean, the prose and the poetry of it all was terrific. And the way it was structured around some interesting components, like beginning with Aristophanes and then the myth of the round people. And then he brought up that around at the end of the paper again with a little interesting twist, which I'll get to. Or the clinical vignette about the young woman who talked about being scantily clad in whatever was barely legally permissible. That was a wonderful little vignette that shows up at the beginning of the paper and again at the end. And so the way the paper was so well integrated and some surprising twists, which I'll mention in a minute. But I wanted to muse a little bit about this Aristophanes myth, because as I read it at the beginning of the paper, I was thinking, wow, what a great myth. This should have been the founding myth of psychoanalysis instead of the Oedipus myth. And what I mean about that was, I like, for one thing, how the myth shows this kind of egalitarian attitude about sexual object choice. We've got male little creatures and female creatures and then male creatures. It's lovely, and there's no sense of a hierarchy here of which one is better, or that there's a lot more of this one than there are that these are normal and typical and these are abnormal. It's all just sort of evenly shows up of these different ways of having object choices. It also shows really well a picture of a divided subject, which is an essential feature of the psychoanalytic worldview. So these little beings who have been cut in half are fundamentally missing something that they're driven to refine through their lives, as we're all driven by our desires for completion. But at the end of the paper, so when Bruce comes back to this myth, he shows how we could be misled by the Aristophanes myth, or how it's not actually a completely psychoanalytic picture, because in the psychoanalytic view, we don't begin with an original identity, as in this myth, where there's a kind of same-sex identities and lesbian identities and heterosexual identities. Um, Bruce shows how in psychoanalysis, those identities come later. Um, so one of the interesting questions I thought that maybe this could be posed to our group discussion is how we um, how we take up identity or not as queer people. And because in some ways, identity has been a life-saving conceptual tool for me. Um, I kind of began my career as a proud homosexual. And in fact, I have a Wikipedia page because I was the first openly gay man to be ordained in the Episcopal Church. So my Wikipedia page is all because of my identity of being a first this, I guess it's gotten harder to get a Wikipedia nowadays, but if you're the first of something, that's one way to get in there. So in some ways, this identity has served me well. It also allowed me to have some self-esteem coming out of a sort of evangelical Christian childhood where I had been sort of obliterated around my sense of self and shamed for it. By having this gay identity, it really gave me a place to feel good about myself through becoming part of this community. But so on one hand, identities are good, but on the other hand, are not identities just another fantasy? So in last month's lecture, I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he gave kind of a Lacanian response. Last month's your webinar was on polarizations, and he mentioned that in the Lacanian model, fantasies are imaginary scenes of completion. I think was his phrase. And so, or we can think of maybe little narrative scripts that account and substitute for what is missing in our lives. And so an identity we could think of as a fantasy for trying to put something in the place where something feels like it's missing. We could also think of fantasies as a way of managing our fears. And again, I want to reference last month's webinar where Barnaby talked about how polarization begins with fears. People have fears coming intrapsychically. Two fears, especially the fear of non-being and the fear of castration. And Barnaby defined castration in a way that I stopped my recording of the webinar and had to write it down and have thought about it many times since. And I think I got it right. Castration as the fear of the loss of the illusion of our efficacy and our authority. So the loss of the illusion of our authority, efficacy, in the face of the incessant efflorescence of desire, a desire that always entails death. So fantasies, I think, are a way, again, we manage these fears, and some fantasies are negative fantasies, like the negative fantasies of the homosexual, the limp-wristed, mincing, feminized man. We can think of this as a socio-cultural fantasy. This is a fearful heterosexual man's fantasy of the homosexual that serves to sustain the heterosexual man's phallic hubris and patriarchal privilege by disavowing aspects of being that would undermine a fragile identity. So these negative fantasies we could think of as examples of destroying what arouses, the title of Bruce's paper. So there's negative fantasies, but positive fantasies of the homosexual are just as problematic. The gay pride identity, which again is, I'm calling it problematic because it serves some useful purpose, but maybe this merits more discussion. As psychoanalysts, we are always called to be suspicious of identities that are too limiting and easily become reified at the expense of something more inclusive. I love the way Bruce ends his paper by putting this mandate of questioning our identities into practice by questioning his own identity. He kind of models that for us. He tells the story of this female client who said that she's wearing as little as legally permissible. Instead of being turned on, he's horrified. And he asks, what was being defended? Was I resisting an unconscious heterosexual script? So maybe I'd like to ask Bruce to say more about that, if he could, if he wants to, especially the line, or was something older being stirred, something institutional, something inherited? So I think I didn't quite know what he meant by that last line. And maybe I'll stop there, and kind of throw it open to, I guess, maybe to Megan, back to Megan, and to the group.
Thank you so much for that. I think you touched on some really, really salient points in Bruce's paper, and thank you for sharing your personal response, but also your personal experiences. I hope that you do share some more of those later, as you said. Bruce, I don't know if you want to explain that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it kind of gets to the core. And thank you both to Philip and to Kelly for your responses to this. And I'm incredibly moved, and I mean, just such rigorous thinking around the paper. But it's the moment, and I think it gets to what Kelly's talking about as well, and what we're alluding to here in our discussion around sexuality is not fixed. And I think in that moment, I pathologized myself as gay, but then I really had to think about this again and again and again about, was I stopping, and I did stop the desire and the kind of erotic charge from this patient. But in doing that, I was preventing something which, and like I said, was it inherited? This pathology of homosexual, that gay men cannot find women attractive, and in many ways, I think that I'd inherited something from a kind of a social, a cultural conditioning, a kind of parental conditioning around what sexuality means, that was preventing a charge, a relationship, a desirous erotic relationship between me and my patient. I mean, I believe more and more that psychoanalysis is an erotic process. And to go back to the original meaning of erotic, I think people often think about erotic as something that's deeply sexual. It is, but it's sexual in the Laplanchian sense, that our very first strivings of desire for the body of the caregiver, are kind of bodily expressions that are felt, they are fused with emotion. And somewhere along the line, and I think Kelly speaks to this when she brings in Laplanche so beautifully, we start disavowing that, and we start shutting something down and foreclosing and restricting our own identities. And so even though, I mean, I was a kind of a proud advocate for gay rights, gay and lesbian rights, gay and LGBT rights when I was at university, etc., and I still am. I've had to realize that in finding psychoanalysis, I've got to undo something of that identity, because I think that you're speaking to this, Philip. There's a rigidity that emerges within this, and I think that the psychoanalytic project has to be without an identity. It can't foreclose. So it's kind of a roundabout way to respond to your question, I suppose.
And I'll just say, yeah, that helped me. When you said, "What the fuck, I'm gay," I initially read that as, oh, he's acknowledging the difficulty as a gay man in sensing the erotic charge of that moment. What I missed was what you helped me see, that you also felt, I guess, like shame about, oh my gosh, something's wrong with me, or there's a disconnect here or something. So So those both are going on there.
Yeah, but in the same way, one can ask a heterosexual. I mean, I'm curious, in terms of if a heterosexual, so-called heterosexual analyst gets a so-called homosexual patient who then starts talking about their erotic desire for their analyst, what happens internally? And this is what I'm curious about, and I'm so struck by when I've spoken to people or um, so-called heterosexual analysts and psychotherapists about this issue, how it's not something that's thought through.
Mm.
It's not
Mm.
something that's considered. It's not, and then I think it's also something that's not felt entirely. It becomes located in some sort of theoretical understanding, which is a defense, once again, a defending of one's own kind of so-called heterosexual identity. Yeah.
Bruce, can I speak to that? I was just so struck by what you said, which is how we need to not come in with an identity. And my immediate thought was I found myself a little bit filled with a bit of rage there actually for a moment where I thought, of course, the marginalized sexuality or the person with a marginalized sexuality with as an analyst needs to take that up. I don't, my feeling was how many heterosexual analysts even think about that identity at all. As much as a queer analyst would have to, or a gay or lesbian analyst would have to. So I found myself just immediately just reflecting on how angry I became, just being like, of course, we have to be the ones to promote this idea. But I think it needs to be across the board. The thing is, it's obviously the focus is on the othered identity as being the one that needs to take up a more polymorphously polysexual kind of stance. And I don't think that that's true necessarily in the theory, and I'm not saying that's true for all so-called heterosexual analysts and psychotherapists. I'm certainly not trying to say that, but I'm just saying it's interesting that that's not necessarily presented. It's presented by you in that way. So I'm sorry that I had a bit of an emotional reaction to you saying that. And I think then you touched on it at the end as well there.
I think that's an important response, though, because I think that's speaks to exactly what happens. I mean, we defend our positions, and especially having been marginalized and knowing that feeling of shame that you've had to carry around, and then fighting, advocating against that. One wants to protect, but identities are fragile, and I think that we need to respond to that. Um, and again, to go back to what I think the psychoanalytic project is, it's about always the element of mystery, always the element of not knowing, and for allowing something of an energy between analyst and patient, between therapist and patient, to emerge. Because I think in that erotic charge, I'm going to call it again. I think Dana Meer refers to it as an erotic charge, so it's hers that I'm borrowing for now. It's that is the process of the kind of the analytic energetic connection.
Megan, can I jump in?
Of course.
Um,
Sorry, let me just say we're now in the discussion. Please don't no one needs to defer to me. We just go. We just riff now.
I just around the political versus the psychoanalytic and how the two of them intersect, because politically all marginalized, activists, myself included for many years, were beating the LGBT blah 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 drum. And to Bruce's point, it's been quite a thing having to undo some of that and recognize that it's essential, but that at some point we have to get beyond that. And I know in many places we are far from beyond that, into something underneath that, which speaks to, I've sort of played with the idea of why do the letters continue to grow? Because somewhere actually we want to think about something that's much more sort of foundational around something fluid and moving than adding another letter to the alphabet.
Yeah, I must.
Barnaby Barrett wrote the paper. We are all queer. I think it's something. I can't remember the title exactly, Barnaby, but exactly that. It speaks to exactly what you've just said, Kelly.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I initially, when I was very young and coming out and all those things, I was very kind of happy to take on the label of lesbian. And I've been in a relationship with a woman. I've been married for almost 10 years. Been in a relationship with her since I was 20. But as I've progressed through my life, I've really been drawn to, prior to getting into clinical work, I've really been drawn to the label of queer, because I think that label came up to address something outside of psychoanalysis, outside of that kind of the space that we're speaking about now, more in the kind of world out there, um, which is to address something of not having a fixed space in which you can, and I think you're right, Kelly. I think it speaks to something about identity is very, very seductive, but it doesn't actually give us often doesn't give us what we're looking for.
Can I ask Philip a question? Um,
Yes.
I mean, it's to go back to you said that there was space to talk about supervision and the homophobia around that.
I was going to ask.
And I was also interested because I think that there's something historically alive here in the room. I mean, you must have been becoming an analyst in a very homophobic environment. And what was that experience like for you? I mean, how did you navigate that?
Well, I'll give you one example because one juicy example, I was presenting a case, to advance these institutes to different levels of faculty, and you have to present cases of patients that you're seeing in analysis. So I was presenting a case, which I was so excited to present because it was such an alive case. It still is, it's ongoing, with um, a male queer patient who had a very strong erotic transference to me, which was such a epiphany for me that I had thought of myself as being beyond that. But and for years, kind of working with this, figuring out different ways to understand it, interpret it, how much of it is defensive, how much of it is productive. In any case, I was presenting this somehow when they formed the faculty committee that was going to examine me for this an analytic work I was doing. It had ended up being the three most hardcore Kleinians in our institute, including the senior guy. And he was so uncomfortable about the erotic transference. And he said that in his experience, he had never had anybody he almost said this proudly, nobody has ever had an erotic transference. But that he had a supervisor. So this supervisor had a supervisor who said, one time, one of my analysans had an erotic transference to me, but I interpreted it as an archaic infantile, blah, blah, blah. And that nipped it in the bud.
God.
Um, and
Oh,
later on after this, I thought, you're cutting off the branch you're sitting on. Why wouldn't you want an alive erotic transference where desire is, vibrating in the room, um, to be continually looked at and understood and see where it's going and what's becoming of it, instead of smothered in in the cradle. So that's an example of how, at least in the institute I belong to, sexuality gets snuffed out, oh, if not just totally ignored. And I like in my practice to always ask myself, where is the erotic energy, uh, especially when where could it be in the work with this patient? Am I missing it? Is it not there? Why is it not there? Um, and hoping that it will show up sooner or later to keep the work alive.
Thank you. Kelly, you wanted to say something?
No, I'm just thinking about that in terms of that question with all patients. Where is the erotic energy in this relationship? And why am I not feeling it if I'm not feeling it?
I published the one paper I have been published was I talked about some of my Kleinian training background, and Melanie Klein wrote a book. Somebody here might remember. It's the analysis of the little boy. Was his name Richard or Dick? There's a Dick and there's a Richard, but the one where she was up in Scotland during the war doing a daily analysis for this little boy. And she wrote a whole book with like detailed verbatims of each session. And she was often interpreting to this little boy that he wanted to put his genital in her. And then she would make these interpretations and say, oftentimes this little boy would head for the door before the session was over. And it was like, no wonder he was trying to get out of there. And I was thinking, so I wrote about, what if I was that little boy? She was assuming little Richard or whatever his name was a heterosexual little boy, was going to grow up to be a heterosexual boy, which was an unfair assumption on her part. And what I tried to do in my own mind was to be a little forgiving of Melanie Klein and try to imagine maybe I could want to put my genital in Melanie Klein. Wouldn't that be fantastic? That would be wonderful. It's hard for me to get there, but why can't we all muster up erotically imaginative scenes with all kinds of people in all kinds of ways? I think it's a good exercise for moving us back towards unconscious desire.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, my association goes to the idea of desire and its relationship to creativity and creative apperception around how do we allow for patients to feel something fully. They may not necessarily later identify as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, but they will find their own sexuality. But there's something about an experience of transference onto the analyst, which is erotic in its excitement of the analyst and its desire of the analyst. Now, that doesn't mean that the patient necessarily wants to put their penis or me to put my penis into her vagina. It may do, but there's something about that kind of bodily excitement that I think that often we then limit when we suddenly give it a binary, give it a label, something shuts down. And I think that, I mean, I know that Klein paper, that Klein book, but yeah, I mean, I actually think, God, if I was that little boy, I would have run a mile. I would have probably shut down the sessions much earlier and still been traumatized, just the idea of Melanie Klein. Um, yeah, there's something I think that links for me here to allowing a patient an experience of creative discharge. And that I think is through desire. And we have to open up a space, and it's very uncomfortable. I mean, this is what I'm saying as well with my patient, what the fuck, I'm gay. Interestingly enough, that patient left soon afterwards. She picked up something of my own internalized homophobia, and that there was something that was shut down. She clearly had some sort of erotic charge toward me, which I did not allow. So I killed anything psychoanalytic between us by creating myself as this homosexual man in the room, rather than opening up a space, which I think are risks that we have to take to allow something in. That for me becomes the psychoanalytic process.
I can tell my own story about that exact same thing where I saw a woman for 2 years, 4 days a week, and it kind of was going nowhere. This was one of my control cases. And then the pandemic hit and she left, gave her a good excuse to sort of to quit. Um, so very attractive woman. And 2 days ago, I was in an apartment building not far from here, and I went up the elevator with somebody, and I kept thinking, she looks so familiar. She's so familiar. Who is that? And I had a strange feeling. And it wasn't until about 48 hours later it dawned on me, oh my God, that was so and so who was in my consulting room 4 days a week for 2 years, and I didn't recognize her. Now she did have a baseball hat on, and but there was some way I missed or wasn't able to open up to the erotic, you know, aliveness of being with her, and I think somehow she experienced that. And felt like I wasn't able to totally receive her. Um, and I feel terrible about that, but that's what happened.
But it's quite interesting because, I mean, I find with a lot of my heterosexual male, so-called heterosexual male patients, often there's a strong erotic charge in the transference, and it's evident in all sorts of ways. And one has to be, and I find that if I say it to a woman or to a gay man, transgender patient, it's more accepted. But the moment, and it's always so tricky, and I'm still trying to figure this one out. If I call that to my so-called heterosexual patient, it's like there's a shutting down immediately. It's like, absolutely not. I have no idea what you're talking about. And inevitably, they'll cancel the next couple of sessions and then come along and like talk about something completely differently. But it's, I suppose it's because one assumes, and this is always the danger, because one has gone through a process of surveilling one's own desire and trying to understand it more and has a sense of it. You know, I think with heterosexual men, and I'm generalizing from a kind of social cultural perspective, something about just the idea, just the thought, if it was made conscious that I might find my analyst sexually exciting, would terrify me, but it's there. And I think that we have to keep it alive. Maybe, I'm not sure, and that's obviously every process is subjective, but there's something about tapping into it. I mean, I've got this male patient now, and he's delightful, and the erotic transferences in every single session. I daren't call it. I know how fragile his sexual identity is around his heterosexuality. But there's something about allowing the so-called flirtation, the transference, the charge to happen because it generates something. It generates his ability to free associate, to play, to be creative.
There are, you guys are, I'm in Los Angeles where it's 10:38 a.m., but you're, I guess, 8:38 a.m. So
Yeah.
at 9 o'clock your time, I'm going to have to sign off exactly because I have a patient who's a heterosexual man who sometimes, who I can joke with or sort of open this up, this area. He, a few weeks ago, said something to me like, he said, like, for instance, let's say let's say I'm in bed with you and I'm saying, I love you. He was meaning you in a very generalized sense. So I made a joke about I love it when he pillow talks to me. And he laughed and I think understood, and he's open enough to sort of be able to work and play with that. So, but a lot of people aren't that far along.
But you raise an interesting point because if you Google like you said, your Wikipedia page, it's very clear that people know that you're gay. You're a gay analyst. I think that, I mean, I don't announce my sexuality to my patients, but I think if people were, they could find out my sexual identity. Heterosexual analysts don't do this. They don't write a page where they say, I'm a heterosexual analyst. And there's something that I think is unfortunate in that, in the mystery of our sexuality, that we have to announce that others don't.
So, Bruce, something that I was feeling when you were reading your paper, and I think it speaks to what you're talking about in terms of how it presents in the consulting room. Well, I don't know, that's sort of what I imagine, is when you were about to list off and you kind of put that disclaimer where you list off those really horrific quotations. I felt myself kind of brace. I braced for impact. And I think that we do this. Well, I mean, I certainly do. I mean, I brace for, and then I think this is the kind of um, reactive kind of thing that we speak about, where we very much like affirm an identity, and we can be quite loud about it in order to protect ourselves immediately. So we kind of put it out there so that we can be prepared for attack. I mean, that's sort of, I think I've seen that a lot in terms of friends and myself. And I think what I wondered if what you were talking about in terms of the oh fuck, I'm gay was a kind of version of that. But internally, obviously. And that was
Absolutely.
obviously felt in the room. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that
I mean,
speaks to exactly that experience.
Mm.
it's so interesting because even in this conversation, I've so I brace for that as you described as well. But at the same time, in the consulting room, I know that I have some sense of refuge on that perceived heterosexual privilege around
Yeah.
I don't have to declare something. And it's there is yeah, I was going to say there's some shame in that, but um it creates safety.
Hmm.
It does, yeah. When Barnaby and I were talking about my chairing this, I was speaking about the privilege of passing, as of being heteronormative or heterosexual passing. I don't, and he said, how have you experienced being in South African psychoanalytic spaces as a queer woman? Have you experienced like feelings of marginalization? And I was like, no, not at all. I mean, my SAPI group has so many queer people, and and I feel like after reading Bruce's paper, I'm so in denial about homophobia in the world. I left an incredibly homophobic, hyper religious background, and I think I went into the world thinking nothing will ever be that bad, everything's great. And Bruce's paper is just, and other things have made me reflect on that. But what I said to Barnaby is I do think that there is so much privilege in passing. I said if my partner, who, is not as feminine and presenting as I am, were in those spaces, would she have the same privilege? Would she feel that same safety? And in the consulting room, you are, the two people that come to my mind, no, let me just leave it at that. But like, there is a safety in being able to embody what is socially normative.
Mm.
Um, yeah.
I wanted to thank Kelly too for your musings on bisexuality, because as that word was coming up both in Bruce's paper and in the conversation, I kept having kind of a reaction like, I don't like that word because it implies it's a kind of a dualism of um, it's another identity, but that a very limited one, that you're either this or you're that, or you're kind of both, but just it misses the polysexuality of possibilities that are available in terms of ways of being in the world. But what did I write down? I think Kelly called it bisexuality is not an identity. It's what did you say? A destabilization of identity?
Yeah, or an
That was very helpful.
anti-identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that it's set up to destabilize what we know as the binary, I guess.
Yeah.
But perhaps, I mean, I think the word is tricky by its very nature in terms of bi. It doesn't speak to poly, which is what if you get into the psychoanalytic um, readings around it, it's referencing a poly state, using perhaps the wrong word.
Mm.
And and then at the same time, you've got the idea that bi people can't choose. They want everything. They want their cake and they want to eat it too. So it's holding the sort of social and or cultural ideas around bisexuality along with the kind of psychoanalytic idea. I find that the contrast around the politics and the psychoanalytic thinking difficult to navigate sometimes.
Mm.
Can I just add to that? Because I think Nicholas Envenis wrote a paper recently, changing the word for him to trance,
Yeah.
to think of us as we're all trance. And it's controversial, but it's important because I think exactly what happened to homosexuality in psychoanalysis is now happening to trans people. And he talks about how we deal in psychoanalysis with so many versions of transference, countertransference, transitional spaces. We're living in a kind of a trance environment all the time. And he thinks about identity loosely, but as a way, trance as a way of being. And I think there's something quite powerful and profound about that. But I see Barnaby wants to come in
Yeah,
conversation,
was
Megan. Over to you.
sorry. Thanks so much, Bruce. Yeah, Barnaby, you'd like to say something, please?
Thank you. Yes, I can't be seen because apparently my video is disabled. Look, I find this discussion just extremely moving, extremely powerful, and extremely important. It also could be taken in about a dozen different directions of all the things that have been raised. And I hope that it will be taken in subsequent discussions. I want to just say a couple of things from the point of view of someone who may have joined this podcast not knowing much about psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis at its heart is a method. It's a method of exploration. It's a method that I, as a queer person, have benefited from enormously. My analyses, both of them, whatever their defects and limitations, freed me to experience the multiplicity of my libidinal body and my queerness. And it was liberating and it was truthful. And that is the method of psychoanalysis. And it might even seem paradoxical to someone coming from outside the discipline and listening to this podcast that here we have four incredible minds talking about things in a very wonderfully erudite, almost mind-blowing fashion. And yet all four of these individuals that have spoken this evening are deeply, passionately dedicated to psychoanalysis. And if you listen to what is said about psychoanalytic theories, you would think that, like little Richard running from Melanie Klein, we should all run from psychoanalysis. But I just want to make the point that psychoanalysis is not its theorizations of the mind. We've heard about a whole series of thoroughly defective, ideologically steeped, homophobic and misogynistic theories from Anna Freud and the whole ego psychology tradition, Melanie Klein and the whole object relations tradition. We didn't touch on Heinz Kohut and the whole tradition of self-psychology and so forth. These are theories of the mind that have nothing to do with the heart and soul of psychoanalysis. And that is extremely difficult for someone who comes outside the discipline to grasp. These are theorizations that deeply encode in a vicious and violent way, as Bruce and Kelly and Philip and you also, Megan, have so vividly described. They viciously encode, perpetuate, either in a way that seems sort of subtle and benign or that is outrightly violent, homophobic, misogynistic values. It's not what psychoanalysis is truly about. Psychoanalysis subverts dichotomies, subverts the dichotomy of homo-hetero, and actually subverts the dichotomy of sex acts on the one hand and the desire, the energy, the fantasies that underlie sex acts and that are very often quite discordant. Just as fantasy although a fantasy may appear to be heterosexual, it actually encodes in a suppressive, repressive form homosexual, homoerotic feelings. So psychoanalysis shows that we are all queer. The problem we face is not only that many of us don't know it, but also that many psychoanalysts, in the name of psychoanalysts, have been promulgating theories which go completely counter to the liberatory aspects of the psychoanalytic method, to which the four of you I know are dedicated, and to which the four of you have bravely trained yourselves and done so in the face of knowing about these difficulties with the things that pass for being psychoanalytic, but are actually defective theories of the mind that then get imposed by some psychotherapists upon the patient. Thank you so much, all four of you. This was an absolute treat, and I hope a beginning rather than a conclusion. Megan, I'll hand back to you to close the meeting.
Thank you, Barnaby. So I just want to say thank you so much. Barnaby, I just wanted to ask if you want to speak about the gender discussion in October. I think that that's an important...
Yeah, thank you. I totally forgot that. I got myself so moved. Two things. One is Dr. Philip Lance is doing one of these podcasts later in the year. He's going to talk precisely about, or he and I are going to talk precisely about what is unconscious desire. What is this energy that we talk about that is profligate and polysemous and polysexual? So there's going to be another chance to hear Philip. But also on the issue that Bruce said, you know, we were jumping up, psychoanalysts were jumping up and down about were gays sick or were gays not sick. Back in the days, the 70s and 80s, I was there. I heard Socarides speak. I heard all those sorts of debates. Now the big debate is around trans. And these people who want to believe, psychoanalysts, supposed psychoanalysts, I don't really want to dignify them with the title, who believe that, you know, boys are boys and girls, and that's all there is to it. And anyone who experiences themselves otherwise must be psychotic. So we are hugely privileged on October the 29th, last Thursday of October. Hopefully this will actually happen. It's scheduled to happen. Dr. Avgi Sakatopoulou has promised to come and be part of the COD podcast. And the title of that is going to be on the genesis of gender. And it will pick up very much as Kelly picked up on a Laplanchian idea that gender is actually formed before the experience of anatomical difference. So that's something very exciting coming up. Megan, thank you for reminding me.
No, I'm very excited about that talk. So it hasn't left my mind. So I just want to say thank you so much for allowing me, a very fledgling clinician in the community, to be a part of this conversation with such incredible minds. And thank you for sharing such personal and, you know, your clinical insights, your case information, case insights, but also your personal experiences, which are, you know, there's a vulnerability in that which is greatly appreciated. And I think Bruce's paper and the vulnerability of sharing that paper, especially, it does a lot for the community in terms of the psychoanalytic community, but I think you do a lot for the queer community and the intersection of those two things. And just by writing this paper, you've done a lot for a lot of people, certainly for myself. So thank you very much. And yeah, thank you to everybody for joining us. So yeah, Bruce, Kelly, Philip, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all the people that have joined us for the webinar this evening. Just to remember that these conversations, these webinars will be held on the last Thursday of each month. So we hope to see you next month, at the end of March. I don't know what the day is of the last Thursday in March, Oh, it will be the 26th of March, yes, because it is a 28-day month. Okay, so hope to see you all then, and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, Megan. Thanks, everyone. Thank you,
Bye.
Philip,
Thank
Bruce.
you.
Thanks.
Bye.